Look through these glasses. What do you see? What color do you see? Is it red, pink, rose, blush, fuchsia, watermelon? As we see the world around us, we interpret a multitude of different colors. There are the primary colors of red, green, blue, yellow, violet, and so on. But every color has many, many variations of that main color. Based on its properties, like how light or dark it is, or how intense or desaturated it is, we can get a full spectrum of all sorts of color. Generally, we give each one of these variations a name, like rose or fuchsia. In design, each property of color is also given a name, and these properties become adjustable on an individual basis. By doing so, you have complete control over every color that we can visibly see. This lesson will go over all of the common terms used to describe the properties of color. When you begin working in programs like Adobe Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator, you will be able to change these individual properties. Let's start first with hue. Hue, in its simplest form, is what we call a color. The hue is the reflected light wave that we see in our eyes and name a color: blue, yellow, green, red, and so on. In design and in print, a hue is described as a color with no values added to it. That is the color in its pure form, with no extra white, black, or grays added to that color. Though we think in terms of primary colors like blue, red, yellow, green, and violet, there are actually hundreds of individual hues to choose from when working in design. Hue is the first property of a hue saturation value, HSV, or hue saturation lightness, HSL, color wheel. That means that in these color wheels, the hue is selected for its color, and then the saturation, value, or lightness. A hue is like naming the actual color of a rag. Is a rag blue, red, green, or another hue? The second property on a HSV or HSL color wheel is saturation. Saturation in color describes the intensity of a color and how well that color is reflected back to us. Colors can be highly saturated, showing the purest form of its hue, or can be desaturated until it gets to a point of having gray tones and you no longer see a color. You can think of saturation like wetting a rag. A dry rag can look dull, whereas a wet rag or saturated rag can be vibrant in color. The more the color is saturated, the more intense that color appears. The final two properties of the color wheel, depending on which model you are using, HSV or HSL, describes how light or dark a color is. They are somewhat different, so let's start with V of the HSV color wheel, which stands for value. Value describes the lightness and darkness of a color. In print or in painting, this is controlled by using more or less blacks, whites, or grays in your color. The same effects can be applied in digital media to give you different values of color. When white is added to a color, it is said to be a tint and make the colors lighter. When black is added to a color, you get a shade of that color. And when gray is added, you have different tones of that color. Sometimes you will hear colors referred to in its tonal range, which is the range of grays from black to white and everything in between for a specific color. The hue saturation value color wheel model is a great way of choosing colors and adjusting their color properties so that you have flexibility in choosing the exact color you want. Other common value wheel models are the hue saturation brightness and hue saturation lightness models. Brightness defines how much light an object is actually emitting, and lightness defines how light or dark the value is compared to other like objects. If an object has a high brightness, then it emits a higher concentration of light, and a low brightness means that it's darker in nature because it does not emit as much light. The lightness or darkness of color refers to how high or little these values are. Again, each one of these properties can be adjusted in just about any graphic design software that you can pinpoint exactly the color that you are going for. In this example, you can see how one color can produce a wide range of different colors by adjusting their properties. By changing the hue of the rest of these properties, you get a bunch of colors to choose from. The final thing I want to mention in this video is contrast. Contrast is the difference in hues, saturations, and values or brightness. Colors that have a higher contrast property means that that property is further away from each other. Take for example these two colors, who have a higher contrast in their hues than these two colors. Or look at the contrast in the saturation values of these two colors versus these two colors. Here, the contrast is in its values, where these two color values are greater apart than these two. Providing high contrast in a design can help make the element stand out, where giving a low contrast can help that element blend more. One of the biggest mistakes I see in design on a constant basis is when a low contrast is used for a design that desperately needs a high contrast. In this example, the text is very hard to see. Even though the colors are different, the value and saturation ranges are identical, creating little contrast and making the text blend into the background. A trick that you can do when designing is to turn your image into a grayscale image. If you do this and the text becomes illegible, it's because there is no contrasting values and needs adjusting. By increasing the contrast and the saturation or value ranges, you can make your focal point stand out. Sometimes you may want less contrast for stylistic choice, but keep this in mind when designing, as most important information generally needs a higher contrast to relay the information and make it easier for the viewer to see. These are the most common terms to define color in design, and so you will want to become familiar with them as you begin using and experimenting with color in your work.